the ova and their development, and then the menstrual cycle, and I doubt we'll get into the regulation. So we pretty much want to cross this off because I don't think we're going to get to this, certainly not in any amount of detail. So let's talk about a few terms here. So the menstrual cycle we describe as the cyclical changes that are happening within a female's body, within the female reproductive system, that happen at the same time, or hopefully at the same time every month, that bring about the reproductive changes. We want to also point out an important part of those changes, which is called ovulation. This is a restricted period of fertility throughout those cyclical changes. So there's a short window where a mature oocyte, which is a mature egg, is ruptured from the ovary, and there is a window with which that oocyte can become fertilized and go on to produce a fertilized egg, which we know becomes an embryo. We also want to point out here that there is a limited pool of gametes in females, and I kind of talked about this in our previous packet. So the literature as it stands now suggests that women are born with a set number of eggs, usually around 400 or so eggs, that are lying dormant in the ovaries, and each of those, well, one of those becomes mature every month. And after all of those are exhausted, then a woman will lose her reproductive ability or reproductive capacity. And I kind of talked about the fact that there is emerging literature that may make its way to the text by the time you guys are practicing or you guys are studying this stuff. So there is some emerging literature that may contradict this theory. Okay, so the functional anatomy of the female reproductive organs, we've got follicles that are containing ovum. So ovum are the undeveloped eggs that are lying dormant in the ovary of a woman, and they're developing every month. They start off as a primordial follicle, which is in its earliest stage of development, and they make their way to become a Graafian follicle, which is a fully developed follicle. There are two important parts to this follicle. There's the oocyte, which is the actual egg that's kind of sitting in here. This has the genetic material, the DNA located within the nucleus. And then there's the granulosa cells, which are surrounding the oocyte, and they are providing the hormones and other support that's necessary for the development of this oocyte. So let's talk about the function of the granulosa cell. And before we get into the actual function, you can compare the granulosa cell to the Sertoli cell in males. So they have the similar role. They're really supporting the development of the gamete itself. They're secreting the hormones. They're also secreting inhibin, which provides the negative feedback onto the pituitary in terms of regulating the hormonal control. So you can really compare the granulosa cells in terms of their function to the Sertoli cells that we saw in males. They're going to be the target cells of estrogen and FSH. So estrogen and FSH, which is coming from the anterior pituitary. They're going to secrete inhibin, which is going to turn off the FSH secretion from the anterior pituitary. And then they're going to supply the nutrients that are required for the development of the oocyte via gap junctions. So the way that they provide these nutrients is via extensive gap junctions. Excuse me. And then finally, they also secrete estrogen. And estrogen is going to have an important role in developing the uterine lining, which is preparing the uterus for the implantation of this hopefully fertilized mature oocyte. So here, let's look a little bit at the anatomy. So we've got the uterus in the female reproductive tract. We've got the fallopian tubes or uterine tubes, and they communicate out to the ovaries. We've got two ovaries, which are located on each side. Now, within the ovary, we can see the follicle in various stages of development. So we've got the primordial follicles, which are the earliest stage of development, and then only one of these follicles will make its way to the most mature phase, which is the Graafian follicle. And as I mentioned before, the follicle is really made of the oocyte itself, which is inside, as well as the granulosa cells, which are providing the hormones and the support, the nutrients and so on, that are important for the development of this follicle to the Graafian stage. So here's a nice table that kind of compares the Sertoli cells to the granulosa cells. As I mentioned before, they kind of have the same sequence or the same series of functions, right? They secrete inhibin, they secrete other important substances, androgen binding protein in the case of Sertoli cells, estrogen in the case of the granulosa cell, that are important in developing the gamete to its fully developed stage. So let's look at the process of oogenesis here. Very similar to spermatogenesis in a few ways, but very different as well in other ways too. So this is where we have an oogonia developing to a mature ova. So once again, one of the major differences here is that women are born, or females are born with a standard number of oogonia, whereas males are continually developing spermatogonia throughout their reproductive life, throughout their entire life, rather. So meiosis starts in fetal life for females. So a female child is born with a set number of eggs. Again, that's the theory at this time. And each of those eggs are arrested in the first meiotic division. So meiosis has two divisions, and a primary oocyte is kind of arrested or stopped during the first of those meiosis divisions. Now, every month when a woman gets to puberty, every month, one of those primary oocytes is going to continue on and complete meiosis 1. And then if that oocyte is fertilized, it will continue on and complete meiosis 2. So all of the oocytes do not progress to meiosis at the same time. They're arrested in the first meiosis division until puberty. One of those oocytes will continue on, complete meiosis 1, and be ovulated or ruptured out of that Graafian follicle. And then if that oocyte becomes fertilized, if there's sperm introduced into the reproductive tract, if their sperm makes its way to the oocyte, only then will meiosis 2 be complete. Otherwise, that arrested oocyte will just disintegrate and be shed off with the uterine lining as a part of the monthly menstrual cycle. Okay, so meiosis is only complete if fertilization takes place. So now we'll move on to speak about the various events of the menstrual cycle. There are two separate events that are taking place here. There's the ovarian cycle, which are the events taking place in the ovaries. And then there's the uterine cycle, which are the events taking place in the uterus. So they're kind of two different perspectives of looking at the same series of events in the female reproductive tract. So we'll start out with the ovarian cycle, which have two subcycles, the follicular phase and the luteal phase, and then we'll talk about the uterine cycle, which has three different subcycles as well. Now, all of these changes, this entire cycle of events is controlled by hormones. So the estrogen and progesterone that are secreted in a woman's body are what influence the progression of these various cycles. So the ovarian cycle has two phases. There's the follicular phase, which is the first 1 to 14 days, and that is followed by the luteal phase, which is days 14 to 28. Now, during the follicular phase, we have what is called the development of the follicle. So this is from the start of the cycle, which is essentially menstruation, which is the bleeding phase, all the way up until day 14, which is the day of ovulation, which is the rupturing of that mature Graafian follicle to release that mature oocyte. That is followed by the luteal phase, which is days 14 to 28. This is the second half of the ovarian cycle. So after ovulation, up until the next phase of menstruation or bleeding, and that lasts 14 days. This is where we have the body preparing for the implantation of this hopefully fertilized mature oocyte. We also have the development of the corpus luteum, and this is why this phase is called the luteal phase. So the corpus luteum is this structure, sometimes called the yellow body. That's what corpus luteum translates to, which takes over the production of hormones for the second half of the ovarian cycle. So days 14 to 28 in preparation for implantation. So let's go through each of these phases and kind of describe what's taking place. So the follicular phase, we've got FSH and estrogen stimulating the development of this follicle from the primordial follicle in its least developed stage all the way to the fully developed Graafian follicle, which then prepares for ovulation. Now we have many primordial follicles that are developing, but when we get later on in the follicular phase, only one primordial follicle will progress to become a full mature Graafian follicle. And at that point, it will have developed a zona pellucida. The zona pellucida is this purple layer, which, this layer which protects the oocyte. It's also going to develop a corona radiata, which is a structure within the oocyte, as well as an antrum, which is a bit of fluid that's formed inside this as well. So only one of these primordial follicles will develop these features and become a mature Graafian follicle. At that point, we have ovulation, which is the rupturing of that oocyte to hopefully become fertilized. This is under the influence of luteinizing hormone. So gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete luteinizing hormone. And then luteinizing hormone has a sharp surge, which then triggers the rupturing of this follicle and then the formation of the corpus luteum. So basically, after day 14, we have this Graafian follicle rupturing, the oocyte exits, but then the rest of the structure becomes the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum takes over the production of hormones that should sustain the initial part of implantation and the initial part of the pregnancy. So this is the luteal phase. We've got the rupture of the follicle that results in the corpus luteum being created here as what's left after that oocyte ruptures out. The corpus luteum, I mentioned earlier, translates to yellow body. It's sometimes called the yellow body. And it goes on to take over hormone production. So it's going to secrete estrogen and progesterone that will help sustain the initial part of this pregnancy. It will do so for about the first 10 days. Now, if there isn't any implantation, because there isn't any fertilization, then the corpus luteum will eventually begin to degenerate or to regress. We call this process luteolysis. So if there aren't any hormones to keep the corpus luteum essentially alive or to keep it around or keep it in its full structure, then the corpus luteum will eventually regress, and that will trigger the shedding of the uterine lining or menstruation or bleeding. So that is happening if the oocyte is not fertilized. If the oocyte is fertilized, then the generation of this corpus luteum does not occur, and it kind of sticks around producing the hormones that are important for maintaining the initial part of implantation and the initial part of pregnancy. So this is showing us the various phases of that follicle of follicular development. We go from a primordial follicle. You don't have to be too bothered with the various stages here, but do understand that we go from a primordial follicle, but only one of those primordial follicles, we can see there are many here, only one of those will eventually become a mature Graafian follicle and will ovulate at the end of that 14-day period. From 14 days to 28 days, we have the production of the corpus luteum, And if there is no hormone being released to sustain the corpus luteum, then the corpus luteum will regress, and that will result in the shedding of the lining, and the cycle starts all over again. I also want to point out the features that are present in immature follicle. That's the corona radiata, the antrum, which is this fluid-filled sac within the follicle, as well as the zona pellucida, which is this layer that surrounds the oocyte, and that is the layer that the mature sperm has to penetrate in order to burrow and make its way into this oocyte, and that is why those enzymes are present in the acrosome of the spermatozoa in order to get through this, this zona pellucida.